All right, let's get started. I am going to turn it over here to John Tinula, who is from Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. I'll keep the introduction short. I know you have a lot of information to share with us today.
Well, thanks, Sarah. And you pronounced my name perfectly. Yes. My name is John Tinula. I am a client services director here at Lawyers Concern for Lawyers. We are the Lawyers Assistance Program here in Minnesota. And at the end of the presentation, I will walk you through a little bit more about who we are, what we do, who we provide services to. I've been a client services director with the organization for something over 2 years now, but I've been a member of LCL for 22 years. I think it's 23 years now, actually. I've been a member, I've been on the board, I've been a volunteer as well. And we'll talk about what some of those opportunities are for folks who might be interested in joining the organization. And one thing I always like to throw out there at the beginning as well is that I'm a person in recovery. I've been sober for something over 23 years now or 24 years now. And I say that because there may be some things that I talk about as we go along that wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you knew that. So back in the day when I decided it was time to stop drinking, my first call was to Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, and I'm ever grateful that they were there for me. And just like for me, we are here for you. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do here today. This program is about the ethical dangers of isolation and loneliness, specifically, obviously, in the legal profession. You could be forgiven if you're wondering how those things connect. Hopefully, obviously, by the end of this, that will be much more obvious than it might be here. But we'll talk a bit about what is the impact of loneliness and isolation, and sort of in general. What are the impacts that loneliness and isolation can have on our physical and mental health? And then we'll specifically talk about it as it relates to the legal profession. We'll talk about how those also can impact our professional responsibility to our clients, to our firm, and how those things might be implicated. And then how creating and sustaining meaningful, supportive connections over time can help benefit ourselves and others. And when we speak about others here, we're really speaking about obviously friends, family, those that are close to us, but our organizations as well. There is an organizational benefit to all the things that we'll be talking about. And I'll try to talk about it both from what's in it for you individually and what's in it for the organization as we go through this. And then we'll talk a bit about how LCL can help as well. One of the ways that we'll do that is we're going to walk through some fact scenarios, just like we did back in law school. We're going to give you a fact pattern, then we're going to talk about what might be happening in each of those instances, what might be happening to the person involved, what might be implicated by what we're seeing from the outside, and then what the implications might be from an ethical standpoint. So why are we talking about this? Back in 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued an advisory that identified loneliness and isolation as an urgent public health challenge that required the nation's immediate awareness and action. Um, I, the report is in your materials. I definitely recommend it if you want to take a deeper dive on some of these issues. I think it's worth a read. Some of the statistics that I will quote to you here in the next few slides are really startling, actually. About 40% of Americans report being lonely. That's a very high percentage of Americans, and that statistic has been getting worse over time. Clearly, the pandemic did not help, but it was happening even before the pandemic. People have been sort of separating from each other. We don't have the same sense of community. Sometimes we talk about tribalism and those kinds of things, and that's sometimes true, and that has its own implications. But I think in general, we just don't seem to be connecting as we once did. So we'll talk a little bit about maybe how that works. And I do want to say one of the things that really jumped out at me, this isn't just a one-off study here. This is based on decades of research. There have been numerous studies that have been done that document not just loneliness and isolation as a condition, but also, what are the outcomes? What comes from that? What are the things that can happen, which we'll obviously talk about. And it doesn't talk about it as this is sort of a correlational thing. It really describes it as this is likely causal. In other words, isolation and loneliness will lead to these types of issues. So we'll talk about that. And it's a direct relationship. The more connected we are, the better our health outcomes will be, which we'll talk about. And the less connected we are, the worse that can be. So when we talk about, how do we combat this? And again, the report details lots of different things that we might do. Um, how do we increase and strengthen those social connections? And I think the way they look at it is the result is it really does actually take a village, maybe the whole village, to try to do this. And I think one of the things that's important to note again is sometimes we think about this or about well-being as sort of this is a personal issue. You as an individual, you kind of just need to deal with this. You need to figure out uh, why are you so isolated? How come you feel so lonely? But it's a both, and I think it's a both end. Organizationally, we need to be making sure that we're providing good opportunities for people to be and to stay connected and to create shared meaning. And again, we'll talk about all of these things as we go along. But it isn't just an individual endeavor here. So this isn't just a seminar about self-care, that you need to do this. We need to do these things. I think that this is really important work. And I suppose it implicates that age-old question of, am I my brother's keeper? And I think, to me at least, over time, both in my recovery and outside of my recovery, I think the answer to that question is yes and no. And I think it's no sometimes when that might constitute enabling, but I think it's yes when we're talking about how can we do things for others that they can't do for themselves. And so I think, those are tricky lines sometimes, and we'll again talk about how we can sort of try to navigate some of those issues when we're dealing with these things. So these are some of the key terms we'll be talking about as we go along. And these are both, some of them are subjective, of them are objective. There's that sense of belonging. And Maslow's hierarchy needs would say that we need to, we need to have and foster close personal relationships, that's really important for us as human beings. We need these sort of deep connections, whether it's with social groups, with places, with individual people, and or collective experiences. And I think all of us can probably come up with examples where we felt that, where we felt like we really were with people that we belonged. We were with, we were in a place that we belonged. I'm Finnish by heritage, and I have visited Finland a couple of times. And one of the times I left, I just really hit me how at home I felt while I was there. It was a really, really unique experience. And I think we can all have that sense. Loneliness is sort of a subjective, right? That's an eye of the beholder kind of a thing. It's distress that's caused by this perception that we don't have the number, quantity, or quality of relationships that we really need or think that we need to have. And so we just feel alone. We feel separated. We feel other. We feel distant from people. And that can come from social isolation, which is sort of objectively not having very many social relationships or social roles that fill our time or group memberships, or we just have infrequent social interactions with other people. However, I would say loneliness isn't necessarily dependent on isolation. Um, we're all different in this regard, and the number of connections that might be necessary for me to not feel isolated or lonely might be very, very different from you. And I think, at least for me, when I was in my drinking career, I could be in a room full of 100 people and still feel alone. That was just sort of the nature of what I dealt with. I don't feel that way anymore, but I think I can identify with people who might say that and that can be true. So it isn't necessarily that there's a set number of relationships we need to be able to do that. And then sort of social connections, that's sort of the continuum of the size and the diversity of our social relationships and the functions that are served by those relationships and the quality of those relationships. And all of these things will be implicated by what we talk about here today. So what is the downside of being, fairly isolated or having this sense of being lonely? And the answer is, well, the statistics are fairly startling, actually. Um, these are a few of them, but loneliness and social isolation increase the risk for premature death by 26% and 29% respectively. And I think this one, the second one here on this line, was one that I almost had to read it a couple of times because I just thought, well, that can't possibly be true. But that a lack of social connection can actually increase the risk of premature death as much as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. So again, these are not sort of disconnected correlational types of connections here in terms of loneliness and isolation. These are direct causal effects of being objectively isolated and being in a state of loneliness. These are the sorts of health effects that it can have for us. And isolation itself can be both really a cause and or the effect of certain mental health conditions that we'll talk about, whether it's depression or anxiety. I mean, our anxiety can cause us to sort of pull away from other people. Depression, similarly, can cause us to pull away from people that care about us. And that's sort of exactly the opposite of what we need to do if we want to maintain our mental health. But it is what happens, and I can describe that in my own experience with drinking was that I didn't really want to be bothered by being around a lot of people because I'd be worried that, what are they thinking? Where is this going to lead to? Are they going to say something about something? So um, these are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of. So it has some potentially really severe mental health or physical health implications, but it also has other implications here. Poor or insufficient social connections are associated with a general increase in the risk of disease. We just went through a COVID epidemic. You could argue that that was probably made worse for folks who were objectively lonely or subjectively lonely. But it can have a 29% increase in a risk of heart disease, a 32% increase in a risk of stroke. It's an increased risk for anxiety, depression, and dementia. There's probably an increase in susceptibility to viruses and respiratory illnesses, as I just mentioned. And then lastly, and as a profession, we're already at increased risk for suicide, but it can lead to that as well. So all of these things combined are, painting a picture of loneliness and isolation as exactly the sort of epidemic that the Surgeon General was mentioning, and that it has potentially severe and troublesome and concerning physical and mental health effects on us. So why are we talking about this in CLE for lawyers? Well, the Harvard Business Review back in 2018 published a report where it broke down various professions. And one of the professions that it said was the loneliest was the law. And to a certain degree, I'm not surprised only because in this job, get to see and hear the stories of people who are talking about what it's like for them and the sort of mental health and other struggles that they're dealing with. Um, and it might seem odd, however, because we as practitioners generally have lots of interactions with people all the time. We're talking to our clients, we're talking to opposing counsel, but all of those or most of those interactions are oppositional or potentially adversarial. So it isn't as if we're having a really nice conversation with a friend asking about, how you doing. These are potentially contentious conversations where we're dealing with opposing counsel talking about a case that's really important for our client, whatever. So I think those are the kinds of things that contribute to the law as being the loneliest type of work. ALM and Law.com Compass Mental Health Survey was done back in 2023, and that identified that more than a third of lawyers feel detached and alone in the world. And not on the slide, but of importance here, and I think both on an individual basis and organizationally, is that loneliness leads to decrease in our job satisfaction. That probably isn't all that surprising. Um, can lead to fewer promotions. So on an individual basis, that can be a problem. Also leads to more frequent job quitting. And again, that's all of these things implicate both the individual, but the organization as well. Retraining, hiring, doing all of these things when people leave is costly and disruptive, and it takes time and energy, and then you have to retrain someone, which can take a long time, and then they have to sort of acclimate themselves to your culture. So it can be very disruptive and sort of not a good situation for an organization. In 2016, and I'll give you some of these statistics in the next slides, the ABA and Hazelden got together and did a study of lawyers and identified that lawyers have 2 to 3 times the risk of certain mental health concerns than the general population. We'll speak directly to some of those statistics. And if you've ever attended one of our seminars, you've heard some or all of these before. And then the last piece I'll say is, generally we like to say that knowledge is power, and knowing that something is true or not true can help us find a solution. But knowing who is at risk for loneliness and isolation is really not the same as knowing what to do about it. So hopefully we can talk about some of the ways that we can combat not just isolation and loneliness, but all of the negative physical and mental health implications that we're talking about here. So let's speak specifically to lawyers. Now, this 2016 study is currently being replicated now. So these statistics will come back out. This was pre-pandemic. I can't speak other than anecdotally at this point because we don't have the data in front of us. yet, but I can say with some level of confidence, I don't think these numbers got any better. I don't think the epidemic or the pandemic rather helped us with regard to some of these things. So some of them is our, lawyers are at a 21% risk of meeting the criteria for substance use disorder. Now, this is identified in the study as problematic drinking. It didn't say alcoholism. It's not as if we're saying 21% of lawyers are alcoholics. We're just saying 21% of lawyers exhibit problematic drinking behaviors. The general population is about 6.4%. 32% of lawyers under 30 and are practicing 10 years or less have that same issue. So it's an even greater percentage of lawyers who have been are new to the practice and or younger. And I don't think that's particularly surprising either, because at that point in our career, we don't have a lot of control over our workflow, who our clients are, what we have to do. We feel as if we just have to do whatever we're told to do. And as lawyers, we'll talk about our personality traits. That's not one that we like very much. We like to have a level of autonomy. In terms of depression, 28% of lawyers suffer from depression, 19% from anxiety. 23% of lawyers suffer from elevated stress. And I would say that the anxiety and the elevated stress pieces of this, I think those percentages for sure have gone up. I think we are getting far more calls nowadays on sort of practice stress and anxiety than we've gotten on depression. And this last statistic is very, very alarming. 11.5% of lawyers have had suicidal thoughts at some point during their career. That is a very serious percentage and something that we take note of. And we do programs on suicide prevention. If you are concerned about someone who might be thinking about suicide, doing nothing is not the right option. Doing something is, and you don't have to do it alone. Call 988 or get a hold of us and we can kind of coach you through what next steps might be for that. This is just a visual presentation of the same statistics we just showed you. Again, sort of starkly shows the differentiation between the general population and lawyers. The one that's not included here are judges. Judges actually, for problematic drinking, were about 9.5%. So they were slightly more than the US population, but a fair amount less as a percentage than lawyers generally, and certainly a fair amount less than lawyers under 30 years old. And I think that has to do with judges having a little bit more control over their autonomy, what they do day in and day out. And I think we can talk about that. Judges have a different set of stressors for sure, and the impact of the decisions that they make and lots of other factors can make their job very, very stressful, and still nonetheless lead to instances of problematic drinking. So these are some of the other ways in which we might cope. So we deal with stress, we deal with anxiety, we deal with the constant demands of our clients. We're getting calls even when we're too busy already, but we got to take this next case. And then, one case finishes and it isn't as if that's it. Well, I can go home and I don't have anything else to worry about. You've got the next case that's coming up. So we look for ways to sort of relieve that stress. And these are some of the ways that we might do it. These are what we would call maladaptive coping mechanisms, alcohol being one, drugs being another. Alcohol and drugs are things that we take into our body. I'd note that the rest of these are sort of what we call process addictions. In other words, these are behaviors. And what's interesting, though, is that the same reward centers of the brain are implicated by each and every one of these things as would be implicated for alcohol or for drugs. So the result is essentially the same. So we reach for these different types of things. The one on the list that I would just pay just a moment's attention to as well is eating disorders. We also have programs that we've done on eating disorders. I have some personal experience, family experience with that as well. And the thing about eating disorders is everybody sort of thinks of maybe Karen Carpenter or other sort of high profile celebrities that have dealt with eating disorders over the years and think that's what an eating disorder is. And that's part of it. But only 6% of people with eating disorders actually are medically underweight. So the reality is you could be looking at someone who looks perfectly healthy, but who is actually quite sick. So the warning signs for eating disorders, or really any of these sorts of things, are often sort of the same. You look for changes in behaviors, things that just don't add up. Changes in eating patterns, shunning food, eating and then disappearing for a little while and then maybe coming back later, some of those kinds of things. Again, we do a program that goes into much more detail, but I just wanted to take 1 minute and spend a little bit more time on that. So what is it about lawyers? Are we really different? And of course we want to think we're different. And as it turns out, I think actually we have good reason to be confident that we are different than the general population. And here are a couple of the ways that we might isolate ourselves. One, perfection. You know, we from the get-go, right in law school, it was hammered into us that we can't make mistakes. Mistakes will cost our clients. They'll cost our clients money. They might cost our clients their freedom. They might cost our clients their lives. So we can't make mistakes. We need to do everything. We need to dot every I, cross every T at all costs, right? That is we are responsible professionally for the things that we do on behalf of our clients. So perfectionism is one of those things that can really drive us. And each of these things you can argue is not a bad thing necessarily in and of itself, but we'll talk about the combination of some of these things in the next slide. But pessimism being the next, we look for all the ways in which things can go wrong. We look for the first wheel, the second wheel, the third and the fourth wheel. When do those come off? How do they come off? In what ways will they come off? Um, Unfortunately, we can't typically draft 4,000-page agreements, but boy, if we could, we sure would, because that would take into account all of the permutations of things that we could think could go wrong. But we do tend to approach things with a pessimistic viewpoint. We need to challenge data. We need to challenge assumptions. We need to challenge another party's argument in a case to try to figure out where are the holes? How do I attack this? What do I do to win this? So uncertainty is, we're supposed to know what's going to happen here. We're supposed to be able to tell our clients, this is what's going to happen, this is how it's going to happen, and this is the most likely result. The reality, of course, is we don't really know that. We can bring our professional judgment and our experience to bear, and we can tell them, listen, in cases like yours, this is what we think will happen. But that's not always how it goes, because we're sort of at the whim and mercy, depending on what kind of practice area you have, of a judge or a jury or opposing counsel. Frankly, our clients. Our clients aren't always our best allies in some of our representations because they can change their mind or they can see things differently one day to the next, and suddenly the outcome will change. And we also deal a lot with vicarious trauma. In other words, we often sit with our clients describing some of the worst days of their lives. And that can't but take a toll on us from a mental health perspective. And so all of the things that we've talked about are implicated in that. So, and our vicarious trauma might also be triggered by something that we ourselves may have experienced. Startlingly, 80% of law students report having experienced some trauma in their lives. So this is a real thing, and it definitely can be something to keep in mind. Again, we do other programs that get into much more detail on vicarious and secondary trauma, and I commend them if you have a chance to see them. So what are some of the unique traits of lawyers that might contribute to some of the things that we're talking about? Larry Richard has done an extensive amount of study on lawyer personality, and he talks a lot about with firms and how to manage different types of personality types, and the people who might be more likely to be really really good rainmakers versus sort of service partners and all of that. Here are some of the ways in which lawyers are really outliers. In other words, these are things where normally you would, on average, the population would be at the 50th percentile. Here, in each of these instances, lawyers are sort of on the other end of that bell curve. One of them is high skepticism. We talked about that in terms of pessimism. We're highly skeptical. We need to challenge data. We need to challenge assumptions. The other is high autonomy. Lawyers like to do what we do. I can do this myself, right? We want to be able to have independent judgment, and sometimes that can make us a little thin-skinned, and we don't particularly always like criticism, and it can be difficult for us to take even constructive criticism. The other is high urgency. Everything's a fire. We're always on our way to a fire, even when things aren't a fire. Sometimes there are fires. The other is low sociability. We aren't always as empathetic or understanding of other folks. We're just trying to get our job done. We just need to plow through this. We're trying to be objective observers of factual situations and trying to best advise our clients of what to do next. Low resilience. We're a little bit low on that, and again, that makes us thin-skinned, all of that sort of thing. And then that low cognitive empathy. It's interesting. The rainmakers tend to be more empathetic. They tend to be able to identify with potential clients much more, whereas service partners don't necessarily. So that's a little bit of an outlier statistic. So who do we worry about when we're talking about isolation? The Harvard study that I mentioned earlier saw law as a low or non-social endeavor. And again, that seems counterintuitive in that we're constantly talking to our clients, we're constantly talking to our colleagues and or our opposing counsel or judges. There's a ton of communication that we engage in, but it isn't social communication. It's again oppositional communication often, and that's sometimes true even within our organizations themselves. There's competition, we're sometimes suspicious of our colleagues as to their motives, and this isn't just something that relates to solo practitioners. This can be again within large organizations. These things can be true. So again, despite the high level of interaction, that high level of communication, we can nonetheless be fairly isolated. We can nonetheless feel the effects of all of the things that we're talking about here. So let's move on to these examples. And what I'm going to do here, I am going to literally read the fact pattern, and then let's talk a little bit about what's happening in each of these instances. And sometimes I might get someone who'd ask the question, is this really real? Is this, is this what you see? And the answer is yes, actually. These aren't fact patterns based on real client scenarios in the sense of, like Dragnet, where we just change the name and all of that. But these are very resonant of the kinds of calls that we get all the time. So let's talk first about James. So James has been practicing in a 50 lawyer firm for much of his long career. He's involved in bar and community activities. He's responsible for the affairs of his elderly father. He's been managing partner of the firm, and he's involved in firm governance over the years and is the same assistant Greta for many, many years. Two of his dearest friends practice in the firm. For years, they played golf together and they've had lunch at least monthly. James' sister died about a month ago after a years-long battle with cancer. Recently, Greta noticed that James had been shutting his door when he gets in. He's not very communicative, stays in his office much of the day. He's not been going to his monthly lunch or attending bar functions, and Greta overheard him telling his friend Jim that they should just plan to play golf without him. When Greta asked if he was okay, he snapped at her and told her not to worry about it. He was just fine. Again, this is not an unusual fact pattern. This is not a wildly imaginative fact pattern by any stretch. These are the kinds of calls that we get. And usually, sometimes James might be the one that would call us, right? So he may be sitting in his office thinking to himself, I don't really know what's going on with me, but I need to figure it out. And hey, I got this brochure from LCL. I think I should give them a call. I think I should see what they might have available for me to kind of help out. But often that's not what happens because we're very often the worst judges of our own mental health or our mental health conditions at any given moment. So what's James doing here? Well, he is isolating. Of course, he's closing his door. He's in there, presumably doing work. Maybe he's calling clients, maybe not. And when I said earlier, one of the things we look for are sort of changes in behavior. There's changes in behavior here that we really need to take stock of. He's not doing something that he used to find pleasure doing. He's telling his friends, "Listen, you guys go play golf without me. I'm just gonna get my work done. I don't need to do this for whatever reason." So is that a sign of depression? It could be. It could very well be that that's a sign of depression. We don't know. We're not diagnosticians here at LCL, and we don't expect you to be either. However, we are observant. We are really good observers of human behaviors, and we can see when things don't seem quite right. What else might be happening here? So James has a number of things, and one of them is grief. So the obvious one in this fact pattern is that his sister died, that she had cancer. So it doesn't say, it's a years long battle or a year long battle with cancer. So arguably you could say it went fairly quickly, but it's a year long battle with cancer. And it's a close personal relative that care about each other. So that's very, very hard. There's another piece here, however. And it doesn't really go into much detail, but it's responsible for the affairs of his elderly father. So there may be some sort of complicated grief here that involves, grieving for the father that he no longer has. His father isn't able to take care of himself like he used to. Many of us are proud of being independent, proud of being able to just take care of whatever we need to take care of. We don't particularly like it when we don't. So we don't know how strained the relationship might be. We don't know, does his father have Alzheimer's? Is there something else going on there? So that could be a complicated grief aspect. And when it comes to grief, I'm going to just mention one thing. We went to the Commission on Lawyers Assistance Program this past year, and it's something we do every year. And one of the presenters talked about grief and loss. And one of the things that she talked about was the loss of a pet. She gave a long list of the things that we might grieve. And it isn't necessarily just death. Again, it could be a loss of a relationship that we um, thought it was, right? So the father you thought you had no longer seems to be the same man. He's not this bigger than life character. He's a diminished person. Divorce, any sort of major changes in your life, but a loss of a pet. She came to that and she said, listen, I get a lot of calls from people that are very distressed when they say they lost their pet, and they're more distressed at losing their pet than they were when they lost their mother. And she said, I have to explain to them, listen, that's not uncommon, and it isn't. I know I'm a dog lover, and it is really, really, really hard to lose a pet. But when we lose people, that is complicated. It's complicated grief because we have relationships that sometimes are maybe not ideal, and maybe we hadn't, maybe the last words we spoke to each other were words in anger, and there's all kinds of things that get wrapped up into human interactions that with pets, they don't care about any of that. They only care that you came home, and they're happy to see you every single time. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. And finally, he's overloaded. He's got a lot of anxiety going on. It could be, the loss of his sister. Maybe he's taken on more responsibility there than he might have anticipated that he had to. Um, and again, with his dad, he's got a lot of work to do with him as well. So he's feeling overloaded. And he's anxious. So are there any ethical implications? Well, maybe, but it's hard to tell here, right? So some of the duties of diligence and communication? Is he calling his clients back like he's supposed to? Is he being diligent? Is he making sure that he's on top of deadlines that are coming up? Is he in the middle of some high stakes litigation where he needs to be aware that filings are due and court responses are due? And is anybody watching? Right? Is there a supervisory responsibility for other members of the firm to say, "Hey, James, what do you got going on? Do you need some help? Do you need some assistance here? We can get you the help you need." I don't know that there's any reason to doubt his professional knowledge here necessarily. I think, at least from these facts, it doesn't seem like that's being implicated. Um, but you know, we don't know. And with depression, and anxiety and all of these things, these can implicate our ability to get our job done. When we start to pull away, when we start to isolate, sometimes that's often where mistakes get made because we're doing things in isolation. So as a firm, again, it's important here to look around and make sure we know what's going on. So there is good news. And the first and foremost one, grief can be addressed. For example, we have a counselor that we work with over at All One, Sand Creek, used to be Sand Creek, who is sort of a specialist in grief and complicated grief issues. So, around the pandemic time, we were probably making a lot more referrals on that than we were used to. So that can be addressed. Depression is absolutely treatable. We send people for various levels of treatment all the time. Those treatment programs are very effective. It isn't necessarily a snap your fingers kind of treatment. It's something that might take some time, but definitely something that can be done. The other is he's got very supportive staff. Greta's been there. She's noticing these things. He has supportive partners. They're also noticing, and they care about him, and they care about his well-being. So that's definitely something that sort of works in his favor. So he's got good support. So what can we do? And I would say whether it's a scenario like this or it's a scenario that relates to alcohol, which we'll talk about one here in a second, is you can have conversations with him and say, James, we're a little bit worried, and we just want to know what's going on. You're sort of pulling away. We're worried you're not going golfing. You're not doing your monthly lunches and all of that. So is there something we can do to help? We can help coach you through those kinds of conversations, and we don't put that in these particular slides, but it comes from a place of care and concerns. Like, listen, we care about you. This is what we've seen. Um, here's what we think we can do to help. And so we can definitely coach you through those conversations. Again, if you feel like James or someone like James seems to be potentially suicidal, or if they're voicing some suicidal ideation, there are lots of things that we can do. Again, we can help you find resources for that. There's a protocol called QPR, question, persuade, refer, that you can kind of look at, go through. There's training that can be gone through that can help with that as well. And again, LCL can coach you through all of this. We can help you find resources. We can help you find things that can help you have those conversations. And if it, is determined that there's something that needs to be done, if there's a treatment program that is available, we can help you find them. We can help connect you with whatever resources you need. So I think in the case of James, there's lots of hope here. It's one of those things where on the outside in the beginning, it looks like there's definitely things to be concerned about, and there certainly is, but I definitely think there's hope as well. So let's talk about Talia. Talia recently made partner in the litigation firm that hired her right out of law school about 4 years ago. She's been recognized as an up-and-coming medical malpractice defense attorney, has turned out to be a great rainmaker for the firm. She's very personable, enjoys wining and dining clients, and is a great asset to her firm. For the past couple months, she gets in around 9:30, 10 o'clock, goes directly into her office, shuts the door, works till lunch. She's been taking 2-hour lunches and sometimes smells like alcohol when she returns. Talia's assistant, Tom, has not been scheduling morning appointments and has deflected questions about Talia's lunch appointments from other firm partners. So what what's happening with Talia? Well, this one's, you could say this one's an easy one in a sense, and it's a fairly classic example, I think, of a concern you might raise about someone you think might be having issues with alcohol or substances. She smells of alcohol. That's kind of a telltale sign. She's coming in late and maybe leaving early. These are again classic signs. She may be hiding her day use even beyond just the potential 2-hour 2 to 3 martini lunch scenario that might be implicated here. She may have a bottle in her desk. That is not an unusual thing for us to hear. These are again sort of classic signs of someone who might be having an issue with alcohol. What are the ethical issues here? I think in some ways it's a little bit like James because we don't really for sure know that her knowledge and skill is being implicated here. She seems like she's still really good at what she does, or at least maybe she's getting her job done. However, I would say impaired lawyers tend to lead to ethical and practice issues. We'll give you some of those statistics in a minute. Um, again, I think she's providing competent services. We don't know for sure if she's not returning every call, but it's at least a concern. So she may be, sloughing off client calls. We're having to, obviously, Tom is sort of, running interference for her to put them at different times of the day. Now, 5.1 would say the firm needs to have measures in place to ensure that lawyers are abiding by the rules. So it's not just about Talia here. There's actually a potentially a firm supervisory requirement, or at least even if it isn't necessarily implicated by the rules because she's a partner, it's certainly a concern from a malpractice standpoint. So I think the firm definitely needs to be aware. The firm needs to be, looking into, hey, what's happening here? Is there something that we might need to do? So the good news here, just like the instance of grief and depression, substance use disorders are absolutely treatable. Um, there are numerous treatment programs. It isn't all one size fit all. There's programs, recovery programs that can help, and more than just AA for those who might have a visceral reaction to a particular program or a different type of program. I don't know that I'd say that there is one size that fits all, certainly, but the reality, and again, the good news is that it is a treatable illness and it's something that people can recover from. And I always say, listen, if I can do it, anybody can do it. So the resources are out there. We can help you find them. The other side here, just like James, she has people around her that care about her. We know that. Um, the problem here might be Tom, actually. He's enabling. We talked about enabling versus helping. In this case, he's sort of enabling her. He's become sort of a codependent in what's going on with her. Um, but again, that puts the onus on others who might be able to help. So what can we do, or what can others do? One, don't enable the behavior. Don't do that. Express the concern. And I would say even with James, because he snapped at Greta in the example we just gave. Those conversations don't always go well in the sense that the person that you're talking to might feel cornered, they might feel picked on, they might feel embarrassed. There's all kinds of reactions. So I say, expect hostility, but you really never know. But look for allies. It could be that she has family members who are also concerned. She may have friends that are also concerned. The partners in the firm, other colleagues. And LCL can help with all of this. We can help you arrange for interventions of a formal nature or a less formal nature. We can find treatment facilities that are able to do to help. After that, we can particularly, I think, help with aftercare. So someone goes through treatment. What we can do is connect them with peer support resources. So we can find another lawyer in recovery that can be available to them to, talk about just about anything. Like, I got a firm party coming up and I'm not sure what to do. What did you do? And that's the beauty of what we do here at LCL, and it's the beauty, frankly, of the recovery programs that I've had the honor and privilege of being a part of. That you just find people who can help you sort of walk through the practical stuff of how do I live a life in recovery? How do I deal with the people around me that I need to deal with? Um, And finally, we have lots of other resources that we can make available to you as well. And we're here for you too. I mean, and we would be here for Talia, of course, but we're here for you as you're working through this because this can be stressful. It's important to make sure that you're taking care of yourself as you try to take care of others. It's just like the advice when you're on the airplane. Make sure you grab your oxygen mask first because you need to make sure you can breathe before you to try to help somebody else breathe. So let's talk a little bit about Susan. So Susan went to law school to fight injustice she saw growing up. After a judicial clerkship and a short stint with a firm, she decided that her best opportunity to be a zealous advocate and secure justice for clients was to be able to choose her own clients and make decisions on what was best for them without having to justify the client or the expense to a firm. She set up a firm in the neighborhood she grew up in, hired a part-time staff member, and she has a growing practice. She feels lucky to be able to give back to the community. She has plenty of clients since there are no other lawyers in the neighborhood. She was recently admonished for filing frivolous pleadings and engaging in a heated argument with opposing counsel in the presence of a judge. It's not the first time that her behavior has raised eyebrows. She has filed some well-intentioned but bizarre motions to vindicate her client's rights and has failed to file pleadings. So what's happening here? Classic case, I suppose, of isolation. Susan is a solo, so she doesn't have a colleague to confer with. She doesn't have someone in the office next to her able to walk in and say, hey, listen, I don't know what to do here. How do I file this claim? What's the posture I should take as to this particular case? She's isolated and she's not, as the facts would indicate, she's not consulting with any colleagues, even outside of her own practice. Um, and I would say not all solo practitioners are isolated. I actually have been practicing with another lawyer for 15 years. It's just Tony and I, and I don't feel isolated at all. But partly because we'd had practice before that, and we'd already practiced within law firms, so we know what we're doing, and we had each other, I suppose. So from a small practice perspective, we didn't have to isolate. But here, a close mentor would really help. Somebody that she can reach out to and ask about various practice issues about various types of things so that maybe she can avoid some of the mistakes that she seems to clearly be making. Here she's pretty clearly overwhelmed. She's got a growing practice, but she's by herself, and so of course she feels an immense level of responsibility to sort of shoulder all of it herself because she thinks at least that there's nowhere else to go. Um, and I think there's always that sort of fear of asking for help. Um, if you're living in a small town, for example, that's difficult to do. If you're asking the other lawyer in town for help, they're like, well, I don't know, is this person even competent? And you can't do it because you might be opposed to them in that particular case. But even for lawyers who work in large organizations, there is that fear of looking as if we aren't competent. That's one of the things that we're supposed to be, and one of the things that we don't want to show any kind of weakness to opposing counsel or others around us because one, you might think it might affect your ability to advocate in your case, but it also might implicate, am I going to get a raise? Am I going to get a promotion? So what are the ethical issues here? She may be competent, right? But not associating it with other colleagues and looking for help for those areas where she might be a little bit weak or not. And by weak, I just simply mean that she isn't as experienced in looking for someone else who does have experience to be able to bounce the idea off of to say, hey, what do you think I should do here? I think is a real deficit. So there is at least that implication that she may in fact not be competent. She may be overzealous in her representation. I mean, we are supposed to zealously advocate for our clients, but there is a line, and that line can be crossed. And in this case, it seems she in fact probably did cross that line. So that particular rule is implicated as well. And she really does need to have policies that deal with conflicts, that deal with a lot of these things. So some sort of supervision. Um, she should be attending CLEs for solos. She should be looking for ways to try to get the collaboration and help that she might need. Um, and then finally, one of the rules that gets implicated here sometimes, which we'll identify in a minute, is 8.3a, which is the as variously described the rat on your friend's rule. Right? So if you see an ethical violation on the part of a lawyer, we're actually ethically bound to report that violation. So people who are watching Susan might in fact be required to make that disclosure. There is, however, an exception. That exception is 8.3c, and that comes into play when you learn of an ethical violation in the course of working with a lawyer's assistance program like LCL. So if you were working with us as a peer support person or here in this organization and you see that, you are not required to report it. Doesn't mean you can't, it just means you don't have to. So it's one exception to that. So I would say with Susan, the discipline here is probably as much as anything a wake-up call. It may be one of those things, and it's hard sometimes when it's happening to you to see, you know, boy, this is really going to work out well for me because you don't see that end in view, but that you look back on it a couple of years later and say, that may have been the best thing that happened to me, that I really needed to be sort of shaken loose and to recognize that I needed to do some things. And so, getting involved in bar associations, getting involved in other organizations, legal organizations that can help. There's subsections of the State Bar Association, for example, for solos and small practitioners that would be really, really good for her. Through LCL, we have a solo small practice group, connections group that would be a great opportunity for Susan to meet other solos and to talk about what that looks like. We also have a discipline and practice group. So for like Susan or anyone, if you get the dreaded letter from the Office of Lawyers Professional Responsibility, we have resources here at LCL. We can kind of help you walk through that, and we've got support for that as well. And Mitchell Hamlin, for example, I know has lots of resources available for solos and smalls for the students who have gone through that. There's lots of CLEs, and again, LCL can provide peer support. So there's definitely support. This is not a hopeless situation by any stretch, but like so often happens, what we don't do when we feel the pain is reach out. We just continue to bear it and we stuff it down and we just ignore it, and then it leads to, you know, problematic and or maladaptive coping mechanisms that we talked about, whether it's problematic drinking or the other behaviors and process addictions that can sometimes come from that, and can also lead to some of those mental health conditions and outcomes that we talked about, depression, anxiety, and the like. So again, while the fact scenario for Susan isn't ideal, there's hope here. There's lots of hope here. And Susan can pull this around. There's no question about that. But it requires some effort on her part to make some connections. So the last scenario is Leonard. Leonard is in his sixth year as an associate in one of the biggest firms in the state. Lenny works hard and is well respected by his clients and his colleagues. He was recognized as an up and coming lawyer, and although he didn't make partner as a fifth year, he's expected to make partner. He attends firm functions, works closely with a number of his colleagues, but any time he's not working is spent with his wife and children. Co-workers are shocked to learn one morning that Lenny had died the previous night. Now, not in the fact scenario here is that Lenny had a drinking problem and he was a closet drinker. He would go out into the garage and drink. And then when everybody went to bed, he would go into the room, watch TV, and drink himself into a stupor until he fell asleep. Um, from the outside, Leonard looks okay, or seemingly looks okay. At a minimum, he's not exhibiting the kinds of behaviors that we saw in some of these other scenarios that might give cause to be alarmed. And so I think if anything, what Leonard, as an example, shows is that we don't always know, and we don't always know which of our colleagues might be having issues, which again goes to, is this an individual issue to deal with, whether it's well-being or isolation and loneliness, or is it an organizational issue? And again, I'd say it's both. We each individually have our own responsibility to try to foster and work on our relationships, but we as firms and organizations can do more to make sure that those connections are possible and to do what we can to sort of combat this. There's a side of this too, and it's a sad thing, and you could say, well, does this happen? And the answer is it does. And the New York Times had published an article not so long ago, and the headline was "Big Law Killed My Husband," and he committed suicide, and he was a very, very successful lawyer, and it was just too much. And I always think, what we need to consider is what does it take for us to get to a place where we think death is a better option? And that is not a good place. And again, we have lots of resources that we have available here at LCL to have these conversations, to try to make sure that we're trying to be good stewards of the profession, which includes being good stewards for our colleagues and helping them, and trying to be there to support them as best we can. While obviously juggling all of the work that we have to do. I recognize that that is no easy uh, task. And why this is one of the reasons why we here at LCL and why I do what I do is we need to keep doing this. We need to keep having these conversations. We need to talk about lawyers like Lenny here or others, the real lawyers who have gone through something very similar to decrease the stigma to the things that we're talking about, to the mental health conditions that we're talking about, and to remove the barriers to recognizing these issues when they're happening, and more critically or as critically for asking for help when these things are happening. So, as organizations, what can we do? We just continue to promote well-being, both as individuals and as organizations, and do the best we can. We'll come up with a couple of examples of what we can do that. So these are sort of listed out some of the rules that I mentioned. You've got 1.1, which is competence. I think we're all familiar with these. We all had to take the NPR, and we all had to know what these were back in the day. We need to know what we do. We need to have the legal knowledge, skill, and preparation necessary to represent our clients. We need to be diligent. We need to be prompt in representing our client, make filings on time. We need to communicate consistently and promptly. We need to give them information, good and bad. We can't withhold that which we think, well, this is going to make me look bad. Nope, we need to give all of it. We need to consult and we need to explain. That's our duty. And then 1.16 is we need to withdraw when it becomes clear that our physical or mental health conditions materially impairs the lawyer's ability to represent the client. This is our permission. This is our permission in those instances where we may need to say, I need to back out of this representation because I'm not going to be able to do the job that I know I can do and that I must do for this client. And to the extent that you're not familiar with it, there is now a leave rule in place. I think it's Rule 18. It's fairly new, so if you're curious, go take a look at it. But if you have a mental or physical health condition that impairs your ability to represent your client, among some other listed reasons, you can request a leave of up to 90 days, and that leave is presumptively granted. So that's a fairly new rule, and I commend it to you to take a look at that. So this is the other part, reporting professional conduct, which we talked about. I won't go into that anymore. So these are statistics that are a little bit off the cuff, but again, these issues have major consequences for us, and the studies will show that 25 to 30% of lawyers facing disciplinary charges suffer from some type of addiction or mental illness. I think that is woefully underreported. I think these are for people who have come forward and maybe said, "Hey, listen, I have a substance use issue as a mitigating factor, or I have a mental health issue as a mitigating factor." For the most part, people aren't necessarily going to do that. So I think those percentages are actually higher because people are not reporting what they might in fact be dealing with. So, but the point here obviously is that these sorts of issues left unaddressed can lead us into issues that implicate our ethical duties to our clients and can lead us into issues that relate to malpractice or disciplinary proceedings. So let's talk a bit more about the importance of connection. So this is a little bit of the country music song played backwards. We are, as individuals and as human beings, we're hardwired to need these relationships, to belong. And it's critical to our brain's sense or feeling of happiness. Physical touch releases oxytocin, which is sort of the happy hormone that makes us feel good, right? There's a Harvard longitudinal study that was done, and it's been going for about 80 years. It was started back in the 1940s, and it involved initially a cohort from Harvard. They were all males because at that time Harvard was all male, and it included JFK and it included Ben Bradley, who was the Washington Post editor, longtime Washington Post editor. They later added a cohort from inner city Boston. And they've been studying all kinds of drivers of health and happiness and all of these sorts of things over all of this time. They're actually into the fourth generation now. We're talking great great grandkids, great 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 grandkids. And one of the most compelling conclusions from the study was that happiness is not to be found in fame, money, professional success, other social success. It's found in relationships. It's all about connection. And I think that that is a really, really one, it's a hopeful thing, I really think, but it's in some ways it seems like it should be intuitively obvious, but it doesn't even think that way. So it's important, and why? It's our health depends on it. Chronic loneliness and social isolation will increase the risk of dementia by 50%. And that is without regard to where you start. In other words, without regard to demographics, socio-demographics, or your health condition. So you could be in a bad health condition. Your dementia risk goes up by 50% based on loneliness and social isolation. Um, Lawyers experiencing high levels of loneliness were nearly 3 times as likely to experience suicidal ideation than those with low levels. Better social connections are a significant predictor of longevity, better physical, cognitive, and mental health. All of these things are true. So here are the benefits of connection. Again, when you look down this list, there's the individual piece of it, and then there's the organizational piece. And sometimes they're together, right? So it creates strong firms and organizations, keeps our people, the people that we depend on to do the work, and the clients coming back. I think sometimes we forget as an organization or organizations, our assets, our tools are our people. And keeping them really is important. I think transience is one of the biggest cost drivers for firms. It's in the billions of dollars. Some firms sort of take the attitude that, listen, we're gonna, they build that into their business model. I think what they don't take into account is that they're also losing superstars because they think the superstars will just stay. That's not always true. But we learn from others, we find our people, we can grow in lots of ways, better engagement, better work quality, better work product, better income potential. So again, there's a whole grab bag of individual and organizational benefits to be found here. What are the challenges? If you're already in a category of gender, race, or culture that has been marginalized historically, that can be difficult. So it can make all of these situations even worse. If you feel unvalued, there was recently a study that talked about um, when we feel valued for the skills and competence that we bring to the table, we tend to be happier in our job. When we feel like we're valued only for the revenue that we can bring or the business side of things, then the opposite is true. If we are unsure, that's also a bad result. So making sure that we value our people for who they are, what they are, and what they bring to the table, I think is really critically important. And being able to show up as your authentic self. One of the keys, I think, to professional happiness is to be able to match your insides and your outsides. Remembering why you went into the profession in the first place, and then trying to match that up with what you do as best you can, right? And listen, none of these things are 100% every single day or every single minute, but these are things to strive for. So here's some of the personal challenges. None of these are particularly shocking, I'm sure. We often have a fear of rejection. When somebody says no, they don't really want to talk to me. All of those things are true. I can do it myself. We don't want to reach out to other people. We might be an introvert or feel socially anxious. We might be treated like an outsider, or we might feel like an outsider. So I think, pivoting and making sure people feel welcome is one of the ways that we can combat that. And we can also just watch for some of the signs of distress and loneliness that we talked about in those scenarios that we brought up here earlier. Approach other people with empathy. When you're in a group of people and you're at a social event and somebody comes up and clearly they're looking for somebody to talk to, open up the group. Pivot your shoulders over, welcome them in, and see where it goes. Introduce yourself, make yourself feel welcome. These little micro acts can actually have resonating effects. And some people say, "Wow, it's just a minute of my life." Right, your whole life is a stream of minutes, just like that. And if we can help someone feel welcome, one, we feel better, and they do too. Um, Thank people for the efforts that they give, create opportunities for connection. So what does it look like? It's inclusive. These next two, the shared success stories and the shared meaning, I think are really important. The best lawyers I ever worked with over the years were always really, really good at sharing the success. They would effusively praise the people that contributed to it. Yes, they were the lead, but they couldn't have done it with the rest of the people. I think that's really important, and it helps people, going back to that earlier slide, feel like they're valued for who they are and what they bring to the table. And, value people for that and focus on our well-being. And for me, same thing, right? High levels of social support increases potential for getting a raise. It also decreases the potential of an employee leaving. It's the right thing to do. So I always like to close this particular program with this Swedish proverb, and that's a burden shared is a half burden, while a joy shared is twice joy. I think that really is true. My experience in recovery has made that abundantly clear to me. So quickly, I know we're running very close to the end. We are Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. We're the Minnesota Lawyers Assistance Program. We help lawyers, judges, law students, legal professionals, and their families. And when I say legal professionals, anybody that works in a legal organization, legal assistants, paralegals, anybody. Our services are free. They're 100% confidential, and we help approximately 400 new individuals each year. We have a 24-hour hotline for in-the-moment counseling if you need it. We have short-term counseling available, up to 4 free sessions per issue. Talked about peer support, coaching. We have a number of different support groups for family. ADHD is one of them. That's we were the first in the country to have one for lawyers. We do referrals to community services. We do CLEs just like this. We have crisis interventions, and we can be there to listen just if you need someone to talk to. We have a partnership with All One Health Group. Here is their information. This is who we would get the 4 free counseling sessions through. There's a way to sign up and log into their member portal if you want to do that on your own. This is our contact information. And finally, always my favorite slide. I always say, when you call Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, you do that because there's help and there's hope. And my answer to someone who would say, how do I know that? Is because that's what I found too. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to what I think is a really important topic, and I hope you got something from it. So have a good rest of your day.